Hello guys, it's Pete from MyJewelryBench.com. I want to thank Kent for sending in his 18 size pocket watch. Today, Kent, we are going to tear your watch down. We are going to give it a full service and polish up the case for you and get everything looking as good as we can. We do have that issue that we spoke about where I cannot get this bezel for you. I'm going to keep looking. I've got next week to run out and do some running around looking for some parts, and we're going to see if we can't find one, but I don't have my hopes up high, although you and I have already spoken about that. With that said, let's get started on the restoration of this pocket watch. So before I do the teardown of this pocket watch, I just want to list all the tools that we'll be using during this video. These are the tools that I'll use to clean and restore this pocket watch. For a link with these tools, you can get them through my affiliate site, and there will be a link in the description below where you can go to my website and have all the tools listed there. If you don't have those, you can buy them. So the fun part is tearing down this pocket watch, any pocket watch actually. I like tearing down watches. I think it's the easiest part. You forget to find out where all the parts go. The first thing I'm going to start with are obviously the case screws. There are 2 case screws that we are going to have to remove, and these are half screws, which makes it even easier because we can just turn them so they don't interfere with the case. And obviously once you get those case screws off, the watch is going to pop out. The next step is to take the hands off. So I'm going to use my hand remover tool, and a link will be on the website for this. I'll remove both the hour and minute hands together as well as the second hand. And you'll see I use a plastic baggie. You can use anything that's not going to damage a dial to protect the dial while you're using a hand remover tool. Now we have a dust ring. We're going to remove that. That dust ring keeps the movement dust free to a point. The next step, I like to remove the balance cock. What I found with this watch is it probably hasn't been serviced in 5 or 6 decades. It is very, very seized up and unusual for a watch to be so difficult to disassemble, but this watch did give me a few issues. We have to do a little prying, gently prying, so that we don't scratch the movement, but we're going to lift that balance cock right off the movement with the complete balance assembly. I use a parts tray, so all my parts are stored separately in a parts tray. Next thing I want to do is remove the case screws. These are those half screws that we were talking about a little bit ago. And I will take those off and put those aside in the parts tray with the dust ring and a few other case parts. So here I'm going to loosen up the 3 dial screws. These are the 3 screws in the side of the case that hold or attach themselves or tighten themselves up to the 3 dial feet on the porcelain dial. You want to loosen those enough so that the dial can slip off without doing any damage to the dial feet. On a porcelain dial, sometimes it can be a little nerve-wracking to replace a dial foot, but yes, it can be done. This dial, although it is very, very dirty and very crusty with some old dust, is in good shape. I didn't see any cracks or chipping on it. Relatively well protected in the Hunter case. I got the dial off, and you can see some of the dirt there along the center to the 4 o'clock position there, and that's about where the hands were laying for years and years. And now we'll start removing all the setting gears and the hour wheel. And I'll use a cannon pinion puller to pull the cannon pinion off. Sometimes those come off easy. This one was pretty seized on the watch. It's always a good idea while you're working on a watch to retighten your case screws. Yeah, that's what I'm doing here. Again, there's 3 of them on this particular watch. Most of the time on American pocket watches you'll see 3, sometimes 2, but most of the time American pocket watches will always have 3 case dial feet screws. Now I released the spring tension, and this spring was fully wound and seized, and now I can remove the bridge that covers the mainspring barrel. This watch is a full plate bridge. Get those 2 screws off, and the mainspring barrel bridge will come right off. Again, I use the parts tray, and I keep all my parts organized by basically their function. You can see some crusty corrosion on that mainspring barrel. Looks like a little bit of dried oil and some corrosion, but not bad. We'll be able to clean that up pretty well. This is the wind gear for the mainspring. And now there are 2 screws holding the full plate bridge on. I am going to loosen those and take those off, and we should be able to lift the full plate off the frame of the watch, exposing the train, all the gears that make the watch work. So here you can see all the gears. Typically a lot of these will fall out, but these were pretty dried in there. It does take a little bit of work. You want to be very careful with these because you don't want to break any of the pinions on the watch itself, because some of these are hard to get. All the gears for the train will go into a separate compartment on the parts tray, and then I can examine the balance jewel. This is the lower balance jewel, and we're going to take a look at that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see, and that jewel is very, very, very dirty, but common on these watches that haven't been serviced in a while. There are no cracks or chips in any of the jewels, so I think we're in good shape with that. This watch was just, left somewhere and neglected. This is the winding, the clutch or the stem insert, where the stem inserts into the watch. So I'm going to remove this gear, and this comes out in 4 pieces, 2 screws, the frame, and the gear itself. So we're going to remove those and do a full service, a full cleaning on those, make sure that they are in good shape. I was surprised to see that these were relatively clean. The next thing, we have the winding and setting gears. So this is a lever set. You can see when we pull that lever out from the movement, it articulates the setting gears, the winding gears, and they are spring driven. We've got a little bit of corrosion on the lever itself. We're going to buff that out with some emery cloth and a rubber buffing wheel, and I'm going to remove that corrosion. I'm not really going to do anything with the springs. They're in good shape. I'm going to clean them up though and just make sure there's a little oil on them to keep them from corroding in the future. These set gears are very, very dirty. And like I said, this leads me to believe that it's been at least 5 or 6 decades since this watch was ever serviced. So here we've got the main screw that holds it in. This is a reverse thread screw, and it should come right out. It should never be so tight or so seized up that you can't get it out, but this screw was pretty much seized in the watch. So to get that out, I typically use a little trick where I'll use some spring oil, and I will soak up either side of that screw on the frame of the watch, and I will try to allow that oil, that spring oil, to get in there, and it seeps in pretty good. And a lot of times I don't have to worry about doing anything harsh to a movement to get certain parts out just by putting a little oil in there. I wouldn't use anything like WD-40 or any kind of penetrating oil. You just want to use some watch oil. It's non-corrosive. It's not going to do any damage to the watch. Here you can see I'm putting in a substantial amount, but that's okay. Again, this is reverse thread, so you're going to turn it clockwise to undo it. And you can see it loosened up pretty good with the oil, and it came right out. Once that's clean, that'll work freely, and I won't have to worry about that. Kent won't have to worry about that for another 30 or 40 years. We'll take out that articulated lever, and you can see the old dried up oil and debris that's been caked on. And if you look at these gears, they're pretty disgusting. Surprisingly, I haven't seen a watch in this kind of shape in a long time, where the oil has dried up so firmly that the parts just don't want to disengage from each other. And you can see on that frame, on that plate, there is a lot of dried up oil on that watch, and it's going to take some aggressive cleaning. So I'm just showing you some of that old grease. You can see it around where that spindle oscillates, and we have the lever now that I will take out. Again, I'm not going to remove the set springs for the lever. I'm going to leave those in place and clean and oil them in place. Now, a good rule of thumb to get some of that dried oil is to use a Q-tip and some mineral spirits, or a soft bristle toothbrush and some mineral spirits, and you can agitate the old dried oil and dirt and get that off of those points. I ended up using some mineral spirits with a Q-tip and just rubbed it out. It took a little work, but it did come out pretty good. And here's that one-click spring for the lever, and that's in good shape. Again, it's not corroded, it's not rusted. It's just a little dirty, and we've got some dust and debris kind of stuck to it. So I'm going to flake that out now. So of course now it's time to get all these parts in the baskets, and we're going to throw them in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'm not going to show the entire part, the whole process of cleaning parts. There is another video. I will link to that in the description, as well as try to put a link in the upper right corner for you to go back and see how I do the cleaning. But these will get stuck in the watch cleaning solution for, I'm actually going to put most of these parts in there for about 10 minutes, maybe a little longer on some of the ones that are a little more dirty. And there's the ultrasonic cleaner. I've got some hot water for rinse, and then a good quality watch rinse. And if you're doing this at home and you don't want to buy some watch rinse, you can use like 90% or 91% rubbing alcohol. It'll do pretty much the same thing. So now it's time to tackle this mainspring barrel. And you can see this barrel's pretty corroded. I'm going to use a rawhide mallet just to pop that barrel pinion out. And that allows me to take the back cover off of the barrel. And let's see if I can lift this out. It did come apart relatively easy, but a ton of oil, a ton of dried up corrosion inside this spring. So I've got the exact same brand new spring for this, so I'm gonna put a brand new one in here, obviously, and that should solve the problem. As you can see, the spring has lost most of its memory and is now basically just a big coil. And it is very, very sticky at this point. Again, been sitting around for a long, long time. So now what I like to do with these parts here, I'll soak them in mineral spirits for a few minutes just to get some of that oil and corrosion off. And then they'll be in the ultrasonic cleaner for about 15 minutes. They'll go through the rinse process, hot water, watch rinse, another bath of watch rinse, and then I'll drive them off and let them sit for about 10 minutes. Here's the new mainspring. Got that all wound in the winder, and we just have to match that T-bar end. The T-bar end has two little tabs at the end of the mainspring, and they go into those little slots in the barrel as well as the barrel cover. So we'll line up our mainspring, make sure those tabs are in place, and I'll pop the mainspring in. If you're going to work on your own watches, you really need to have a mainspring winder. You can get them, in used condition on eBay for the most part. I haven't seen too many that are bad. And you can buy new ones. New cost anywhere from $60 to a few $100 depending on the barrels you need. And now I'm just going to give the mainspring a little oil with some spring oil, watch spring oil. And that'll keep that mainspring from drying up. We'll put the barrel pinion back in. It'll only go in one way, so make sure you do get it installed the right way. And then we'll line up the cover with that slot. You can see the T-bar end of the mainspring there as I put the cover back on. And that cover just pretty much snaps on. Most mainspring barrels have a snap-on cover. Some will just sit on top of each other and they'll be held in place by the bridges. But American pocket watches and most wristwatches have snap-on barrel covers. Now it's time to get the lever put back on the watch. I did put it on and I ended up taking it off and redoing it after I got the set gears all put in place. So of course we're starting the final assembly or the complete assembly now. I apologize for the focus, but we're looking for some articulating action. This lever was pretty seized up before, but it's free now, and I think a lot of it had to do with the old oil that was on the frame of the watch case, or the frame of the watch movement. So now I'm just going to fit the gears so I know where they go, and it's pretty obvious where these gears go. But just in case, now these were soaked in a mineral bath. Some of the wear on there is not coming out. Looks like some dirt and oil just seeped into the pores on the brass. But I was able to clean and polish everything else up to a good point. I'm putting some oil on the cover, and that will hold the gears in place, allowing me to flip up these parts and put this cover, or this little set bridge, back in place. Now there is no up or down to these gears. Sometimes on Swiss watches, gears have to go in a certain direction, but in most American pocket watches from this era, you can put them in upside down and they're still going to be exactly the same. So here I'll just put that set bridge in, and that one gave me a little bit of a problem, but it'll stay in place once enough oil is holding it in place. Be gentle with the tweezers, you don't want to force anything. Now if you haven't done this before, you may have to just finagle some of these gears around like I am here. And that's okay. It's pretty normal if they're not held in place very well. I don't put a lot of oil on these parts, just enough to reduce all the friction. And then it's a matter of getting everything lined up. I'll put that set bridge screw on. Again, remember this is reverse thread, so you are going to have to tighten it by turning it counterclockwise. I will give it usually a half a turn in the opposite direction to line up the threads, and once it seats, I can then tighten it up. And I do that with just about every single screw, and if you're going to work on these yourself, you should do that too. Now I'll make sure that the clicks are all in fine working order. These springs, these click springs, should allow everything to articulate very well. You can see I took off the lever there just to make sure that was done correctly, and now I'm putting the lever back on. And for the most part, you can see I got about 95 to 99% of all the corrosion off that lever. Anytime you clean a part, you should always, anytime you polish off a part with a rubber wheel or some emery cloth, or however you're going to clean debris or corrosion off a part, remember to always clean it thoroughly. Now we're going to get the winding system back, the stem insert location back in place. This gear goes in one way, so there's no error. You can't flip it around and do it wrong. And we'll just tighten it up with its two screws. Very simple installation. These watches are not very complicated, but we are coming up to one of the hardest parts of any full bridge plate movement. I think I've covered this before in some other videos, but we're going to cover it again. So you can see I'm just tightening up those two screws, making sure that they are in good shape. I'm going to put a little dab of oil on these parts just to make sure they turn smoothly and don't corrode in the future. And then I have a winder. I have a bunch of spring winders that I keep for American and European watches, and then I can test and make sure everything is working properly before I move on to the next step. And that's how you should do any watch. Test it as you go and make sure that everything works correctly. So here you can see I'm just going between the winding and the setting system. So here we're looking at the bottom plate, and we're just looking at that jewel, and you can see it's nice and clean. There are no cracks in it. What you see are lines from the background. Now on an 18 size full bridge plate movement like this, I install everything upside down. And that's because of this pallet here. This pallet fork has to go underneath that jewel, and you can't get it in place if you put all of your gears on the main frame of the watch movement. So I put them on the bridge plate, and then I will take the bridge plate itself and come in from the top and make sure that the pinions on all of my train gears are seated correctly before I do anything else or go further. Each gear will go in a certain order. If you are taking a watch apart, make sure you take pictures of it if you're not familiar with how it goes back together. That way you don't make any mistakes with the reverse assembly order. Now at this point, I don't oil any of the movement as I do the assembly. I don't personally do that. Some people do, but I like to wait until the watch is mostly assembled before I go ahead and go any further. Here on the main frame, I'm putting in the mainspring click, and the click spring there is already in place, and there is our winding gear for the mainspring. You can install this after you've assembled the bridge plate to the frame. However, I think I just was in the mode of going forth with that, and I just put it all together before I stuck it over the bridge plate. So here I've got my bridge plate assembled with the gears, and now I will take the frame of the watch and I will come in from the top, and I will try to get it aligned so that all my gears pinions come through each of the pinion points, or their bushings or jewels. This takes a little bit of finagling with a full bridge movement, so just take your time. I did a service on a Chinese watch movement last week, so if you get a chance, you can go see how complicated that was with that full bridge, being that it's about a third the size of this watch. And now I'll grab my fine nose tweezers, and I will just start making sure that each of the train gears pinions protrudes into the pivot points of the frame. And I'm putting very little pressure on my fingers to hold this together. I just want the train kind of fall into place. And once everything falls into place, then you can kind of tighten it up with your screws. So I've got that all assembled. All the gears are in good position. And now there's 2 screws that hold this full bridge onto the frame. And that's what I'm working with, just those 2 screws. There are 4 screws that hold this watch together. 2 of those screws are the mainspring barrel bridge screws. So now I'm just going to tighten them. I'm not going to tighten them too tight, because what I want to do is just make sure that they're holding the movement together without too much play. And I'll double check the gears, make sure that there's free movement on all the gears, and that everything is going to work without any damage. Once I've done that, then I'll tighten up the screws so that I'm happy with the holding power of the watch as it's assembled. Now I'm just checking these gears just to make sure. Very little pressure. I just want to see that everything moves freely and that there's no friction or no binding of the movement. We'll tighten up those 2 screws and make sure everything is ready for the next step. So here we've got our perfectly clean new mainspring barrel, and we are going to get that back into the watch movement. Now there is that winding gear, and I can adjust the position of that winding gear because it is keyed. And if I turn it with the mainspring winder, it'll key itself into place. And then we can put the bridge on and tighten the last 2 screws to hold the watch together. Again, what I'll do is I will just tighten these enough so that it's held together, and I will give it a test wind and make sure that everything is free before moving on to the next step, which is oiling each of the pivots. I'll first start with the underside, and then I'll work with the top. And every single pivot, every jewel point should get a small amount of oil just to make sure that it runs free. With that done, I'll give this another test and just make sure that we still have no issues and everything's working good. The next step is to put the balance wheel and the balance cock back on. This has been thoroughly cleaned and I've pre-oiled it, and I just do a little test. You can see it took right off. This watch is living again. Now I will gently tighten the balance screw down until I get the balance in. And once there's no friction on there, I usually tighten it up a little bit more and put it in its final position. And the final part of the assembly, obviously here I'm just looking at the escapement, making sure it's working. The final part of the assembly is to start putting the set gear, the cannon pinion back on, and the hour wheel. Now this watch did not have a dial washer on it, so I pulled out a dial washer that'll hold the hour wheel down. There's the hour wheel going in there. And I like to have a dial washer on these just to make sure. Now this is a good test because now I can test the winding and the setting of the system and make sure that everything works good. And you can see when we're in setting mode, we can turn the hands. Everything moves freely. Now I'm going to release the dial screws. Remember, there are 3 of those. We're going to loosen those up and place our dial in position. Just be careful with the dial. If it does give you a little bit of a hard time at the dial feet position, loosen those screws up just a little bit more, and you should be able to get the dial to just snap into place without doing any real damage to it. Once those are done, you can tighten up the dial screws. Remember, there are 3 of them, and that'll hold the dial in position. It also holds the set gears, the hour wheel. It holds those all in position. And what I like to do is just put the second hand on a watch just to make sure it works, at least with American pocket watches. And I will rotate it until I get it to a point where it's not going to rub against the dial. And I'll let that run for a little while I move on to the next phase of this restoration. Here you can see I'm just snapping on the dust cover, and I am going to let this watch set for a little while and run and just make sure that it runs well. The next step is to clean up the case. The case is actually in really, really good shape, although, yes, it's missing the bezel, and the bezel on a Hunter case pocket watch can be a nightmare to find. This watch hasn't been worn through, so even though it's gold filled, none of the brassing has basically come through yet. The engraving is in good shape, so I'm going to use some polish, and I'm going to hand polish this, and then I'm going to clean it in an ultrasonic cleaner. To hand polish, I use a microfiber towel to rest the watch on, and I'll use a paper toweling, usually a dust-free paper toweling, and I'll just start hand rubbing the polish onto the case itself. I don't like to use a buffing machine on gold-filled watches because if you got a thin spot of gold-filled cover, you can run that down to brass and actually damage the watch. It's better to do it by hand if you can. Usually it looks really bad while you're doing it, but once I rub this off and then clean the watch case, it's going to look pretty good. To tell the difference between a gold watch case and a gold-filled watch case, there are a couple glaring identifiers. First, gold-filled watches, at least those made in America, will always have a warranty period. Like this watch case is warranted for 20 or 25 years. That's a good indication that it's gold-filled. You also want to look at the gold maker's marks. Some watches can be solid gold, and they'll be marked correspondingly. So here I'm just polishing up every bit of the watch itself, the case itself, and the outside cover, which you can see here. It looks really good. Again, I like to hand polish gold-filled cases just because I don't want to rub through or buff out through to the brass. Gold-filled cases are typically one layer of brass sandwiched in between 2 very, very thin layers of gold. And that was your wear point. So now I'm just cleaning it off with a polishing cloth. I'm just going to wipe it down. This is not the final cleaning. I just want to get as much of the debris and residue off the watch as I can before I put it in an ultrasonic cleaner. And then this will sit in the ultrasonic cleaner for about 30 minutes. And that should make sure that any dirt and debris that's stuck in that will come out, as well as any of the nooks and crannies in the case. Once that's done, I'll dry it off and rinse it with a good watch rinse solution, and then move on to the final assembly, which is to case the watch. So here you can see I'm putting the 2 case screws back in. These are those half cut screws, and those are going to hold our watch movement into the watch case. On a Hunter case pocket watch, the 3 o'clock position on a watch is where the stem goes. On an open face, it's typically at the 12 o'clock position. So while holding this watch with my finger on the opposite side, I can turn these half screws to a point where they hold in the movement to the case. And once they're tight, I'll close up the back, make sure the back is nice and tight. And you can see we've got a good polish on that cover. It's in good shape. Now it's time to set the hour hand and the minute hand. First thing you start with is the hour hand, because that one has to go on first. Make sure that it's elevated enough so that it's free of the second hand and free of any other markers on the case or dial that it could come in contact with. The second is the minute hand. We'll put that on. I'm going to tighten that up on the cannon pinion, and then I always like to go around and just make sure that all the hands move freely, that there's no interference, and that everything sets and winds well. And there you go. I think I've got this pretty much done. There are some marks on this case. I think for the most part, though, those aren't very deep scratches. And again, I don't want to buff them out with a buffing machine, because if there is any thinning of the gold-filled material, the brass will show through, and we don't want to do that. So Kent, your pocket watch hinge works perfectly. I did clean and oil it a little bit so that it works really, really well. And that does seal up the watch as best we can without a bezel. Again, I'll be looking for a bezel for you over the next few days, and hopefully I can find one. But like I said, I don't really have much hope. Since cases were not standard, you know, a manufacturer might have made a couple hundred cases or a few thousand cases, and you know, parts for those, once they're lost, unfortunately, are lost. That is the restoration of this beautiful 18 size Elgin Hunter case watch. I hope you liked this video. If you did, guys, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And I want to thank all my Patreon supporters for the support of my channel, as it does help me to make more videos for you. Please have a great week and stay safe.